Castlevania is an enormous series. It's a clusterfuck. And it was still even pretty complicated back in 1997 when Symphony of the Night came out, when Koji Igarashi decided to drastically revamp the series after seeing a bunch of Castlevania games on sale in a Japanese bargain bin. Before Castlevania became Metroidvania, it was a series of kind of cheap thrills. You would play it for a couple days, figuring out how, where, and when you'd die, which would take a while, but your final successful run would only last like 3 hours or so. Once you had your practice, you could go from A to B, start to finish, all in one quiet afternoon without really missing much along the way, or having a real reason to do it all over again. So an impetus to give the series more length and strength caused Igarashi to move from assistant producer on Symphony to producer on practically the whole series, which he kind of fell in love with, and made like 13 more games to complicate the series with. Unfortunately though, Konami had other plans. After deciding the 2D Castlevanias weren't big and badass enough, they shipped him off to mobile divisions before canceling all his new games for years before he got fed up, threw his arms up in the air, quit and made a Kickstarter. Which reminded me to do something. I'm probably just as surprised as you are to find out that I'd never actually played Symphony of the Night. Well, at least not past those first 30 minutes, ages ago, before getting distracted and moving on to something else. Anyways, 2 recent playthroughs this week have me ready to answer this burning question behind Igarashi's modern relevance. Does Symphony still hold up? For the most part, it sure does. Aesthetically, at least. I'm about to put it under a real microscope, but overall I had a pretty damn good time. Those first 30 minutes are about as hilarious as I remember.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of...
That glass shatter is freaking great. That's ridiculous. I love the upbeat goth style of this thing. It reminds me of how harmless the spookiest kids in the 90s were. Igarashi's change in game design was also accompanied by a change in character design, courtesy of the new artist Ayami Kojima, no relation, who re-engineered Castlevania's heroes from the bulging, westernized Schwarzeneggers of the older games into effeminate anime boys for the newer ones. These character portraits are fabulous, these backgrounds are flamboyant, and the mishmash of old and new enemy sprites juggle a range of styles, from cute to campy to cheesy to grotesque and macabre. It's a 90s goth costume party, complete with a kitschy and catchy synthesized organ soundtrack, brought to us by yet another Castlevania newcomer, Michiru Yamane. All 3 of these names keep popping up on the credits for the now called Igavania games, and so do a lot of reused sprites from Symphony of the Night. And maybe that's because Symphony set a damn near 10-year benchmark for pixel art. Seriously, I was playing King of Fighters 13 just a couple hours earlier, and jumping back 13 years to Symphony is far less jarring than it should be. You certainly got a lot less pixels per screen here, but there is no deficit for talent put into them. Alucard's ample frames of animation were polished to a mere sheen. I love how many of these backgrounds are carefully shaded to convey curved shapes and depth. The 3D elements that are there are used how they should be used, with subtlety. The entrance hallway looks spectacular, as do the long shadows in these lava caves. And it stands as a testament that advanced 2D games have aged far better than early 3D games. So it looks great, it looks stylish and graceful, but it's all kind of gaudy, to be honest, which means it's time to dish out some constructive criticism. These sprites are so big and detailed that they oftentimes take up the whole screen, and that ends up kind of breaking some very established 2D conventions that survived both before and after Symphony. Something feels inherently wrong about killing these giant angry wolves in one hit. They're huge, they're menacing, they're pissed off, but just one light tap to their nose makes them blow up. It's like a prelude for the countless long, flat, empty hallways that are occupied by just about one giant easy enemy per screen length. In many ways, Symphony feels like a Super Nintendo game out of its time and place, perhaps thanks to its original lineage as a Sega 32X game before being redesigned for the PlayStation. They had a whole lot of 2D pixel art assets on their hands ported over to a 3D-ready engine to add a lot of cool effects to them and make them look great. It has so much style and so much content that I'm wondering if that accounts for a lack of substance. It seems like Symphony misses a lot of the nuances of side-scrolling level design that earlier games, even ones in its own series, had in abundance. Which means I get to enter into one of the stupidest grand debates of our time, and I'll lay it all out right here. Super Metroid had better level design than Symphony of the Night. In revamping this game to have players backtrack through it, they seem to have forgotten the need to double down on the nuance of each individual room. Whereas Metroid and even previous Castlevanias would have new, unique challenges and visually recognizable rooms throughout the whole game, Symphony has this tendency to just copy the same exact challenge 2, 3, or even 4 times across a room before you can make it to the other side. A lot of these transition rooms and connecting hallways are a chore to backtrack across, and there's visible lack of foresight put into this game's exhaustive and extensive features list. It's probably best seen at these stone roses and the outer walls. They shoot a projectile that petrifies you, leaving you immobilized and vulnerable to, nothing in particular, because there's no other enemies around. Even if you get hit twice, the effect doesn't stack. You can get caught in an infinite petrifying loop if the follow-up shot happens to land 1 pixel underneath your shield. Of course, you could carry one of these stat-boosting armors or potions with you to help, because suddenly Castlevania is an RPG now. And it really did not need to be one. The level-up system can be safely ignored throughout the whole game, because it's also like Metroid now. Rather than grinding to increase numbers on your character sheet, you can become stronger in a much more organic way through exploration. Or at least that's the idea. It's not effective in practice, though. There's nothing that feels more pointless than working your way around dangerous new hazards only to uncover a sword or armor or something that has lower stats than what you already had. You can't even sell this stuff for money. All you can just do is throw it in the garbage section of an inventory that fills up with an increasing amount of garbage. In Metroid, the most useless collectibles you'd uncover would at least increase your ammo cap or something. In Symphony, the most useless collectibles are really, literally useless. I didn't feel like I was saving money to buy nice equipment at the shop during my first playthrough, but the lack of other meaningful things to purchase meant that the Damascus Sword and Diamond Mail had me ignoring the vast majority of pickups I was finding out in the wild. Like these caches of elemental-specific resistance potions you'll never use because it's still an action game. You can still just jump and dodge your way around hazards and do just fine. Or not, because Castlevania is an RPG now. You can just power through stuff and let your armor and HP cap take the hit. The Clock Tower rooms are probably the best example of wasted side-scrolling potential here. It's a classic challenge, vertical navigation through horizontal hazards, with the constant threat of a classic Castlevania knockback kicking you all the way back down to where you started. But with all the backtracking in this game, you need to go up, down, and around this room multiple times, and that classic Castlevania knockback gets old real fast. And doing it multiple times means your frustration at these stupid Medusa heads gets multiplied multiple times. What would be an amazing accomplishment in Classicvania becomes kind of an S&M session in Igavania, where the most exciting challenges can be effortlessly powered through thanks to the RPG system, and they're encouraged to be powered through thanks to the backtracking. Because of that Metroidvania revamp, the entire game's focus is now more about a constant sense of progression rather than individual rooms and combat. And their first attempt to juggle those diverging priorities is honestly probably less graceful than fans remember it being, because so many rooms are just flat lines with few enemies, and the progression system doesn't really reward thorough exploration. The game's intimidating and frustrating at times, but it's also too easy overall, which just means it's not balanced. It's not hard to buff your character up to overpowering stats, even while ignoring the massive amounts of extraneous content you can find, but very rarely can you actually use it. Remember the magic system? I don't blame you if you don't, you can just ignore it. What about the familiars? They're not a big help either. Even though you keep finding all these new weapons, most of them animate with the same slash animation you had in the very beginning. You do get a double jump, which thankfully changes things a bit, but besides that, the combat doesn't really get more or less complicated as the game goes on. Your numbers just go up. And one of the most bewildering artifacts found when playing this game nowadays is how the level design doesn't funnel you through even the majority of the game's content. Although your inventory gets so messy and cluttered, you really need only 4 of these items to get to the final boss and trigger the ending. But until then, you're only routed through the upper half of the map with a brilliant, beautiful lower half full of great bosses and backgrounds that can get completely ignored. Stumbling your way down there is a compelling dig against overwhelming enemies that are guarding nothing, really. This boss is a congealed symbiotic mass of reanimated corpses. It's totally rad, but once you beat him and move on, you hit a dead end with just a mildly underpowered elemental-specific sword that goes straight in the trash. It would not be unreasonable to get deliberately pushed to an underwhelming and anticlimactic bad ending for this game. The entire lower half of the map is missable. To be fair, it's not easily missable, but what is easily missable are two secret items hidden at extreme corners of the map that turn the final boss into something that's not so final after all, before opening up an entire inverted map that has you going all the way through the whole castle again, but with more powerful enemies and redesigned rooms, and I really like how most of it this time is built to account for your full moveset, which unfortunately means that most of the treasure your exploration uncovers is even more useless this time. Don't get me wrong, I think this is a really cool idea. Entirely swapping out world maps halfway through a massive non-linear game is something that not a lot of games can even afford to attempt. But I think the way it's used here only really worked for a few specific years of the late 90s. Keep in mind that back in 1997, the previous Castlevania game averaged about 7 hours long if you knew what you were doing, so back then, discovering that you had incidentally missed hours upon hours of extra content would be adding an actual significant amount of value to this product. Finding out that the actual majority of the game could be entirely missed would be an amazing moment, a shocking discovery that completely changes your perspective on what exactly was even on the game's disc in the first place. It's a true realization of Igarashi's goal to give this game more value and keep it out of that bargain bin forever. But right now, in 2015, the idea of optional content conjures memories of secret levels that are treated like a treat, and not the main course. It's like finding out that on the last night of your vacation, your hotel gave you a mini fridge full of free snacks and you didn't know it until the very end of the trip. Or something. When I flew up that castle, fought Richter, and rolled the credits, my first thought was, that seems short. That can't be right. 5 minutes later on Google, I was all like, oh, that explains it. But in 1997, I would have flown up that castle, fought Richter, and rolled the credits and said, yeah, that seems about right. And then weeks later, I might find out about the inverted castle from a strategy guide or a magazine, or even just playing the game some more, and the reaction would have been more like, holy shit, that's awesome, that's like breaking a rule or something. Because it kinda was. Symphony of the Night aggressively pursued a new direction for the series that ended up establishing a whole new genre of games themselves. It was a clear attempt to break away from the established norms, symbolized in the faux final duel between Alucard's flashy new moveset and Richter's stiff sprites, reused from the older games. The false start, the false ending, and even the Oedipal underlyings of this awfully cheesy dialogue all hint at a respectful distaste for the old way of doing things. Taking risks like that is a practice that has very easily waned away from AAA gaming, and the desire to turn Castlevania into a big, overproduced God of War beat-em-up is eventually what waned away Igarashi's own spin on the franchise, which itself had an 11-year run that a lot of people would argue got tired. Until, that is, he got the gang back together to kickstart another one by a different name, and now the hype's through the roof. It's ironic that the most support given on this experimental new funding platform seems to be for projects that remake what's old and what's established. But regardless of its quirks, of what works and what doesn't, it's finally clear to me now why the appeal of Symphony has lasted for almost 2 decades, and why so many people are eager to relive that magic. It's a fun game, energetic and jubilant in both its style and design, cheerfully experimenting with a mishmash of old and new content while aiming to reinvent and save its franchise at the same time. It gives us gothic horror with a glittery smile and an overcompensating amount of complexity that leaves room for ridiculous speedrunning and sequence-breaking tricks. The layout of this map and its treasures may feel archaic, but in many ways, its presentation is still cutting edge.